July 1944. Outside Falaise, Normandy. A German Panzer NCO stands inside a prisoner enclosure watching something through a chain-link fence. He is 28. In armored service since Barbarossa, he has commanded a Panzer IV across 3 countries and rebuilt engines at 2 in the morning in Russian fields with a flashlight clenched between his teeth. He knows what maintaining a tank costs. 50 meters away, 4 Americans are working on a dead Sherman. They are not careful, in the sense a German workshop would understand careful. They are fast. They unbolt the rear deck panels, rig a chain hoist to the recovery vehicle parked alongside, and lift the entire engine out of the hull as one piece. Not the valves, not the pistons. The whole engine, onto a wooden pallet on the ground. Then a replacement unit rolls in on a dolly, drops into the hull, gets connected. At one point, a wrench lands on another mechanic's foot. The words spoken are not recorded in the Allied intelligence summary, where this scene, and dozens like it, eventually accumulated. 4 hours after they started, the Sherman runs. The NCO knows that swapping the Maybach HL 230 and a Panther is a 2-day workshop job under good conditions. He has watched a Tiger replacement stretch to 4 days over one stripped bolt. What he cannot know, standing at that fence, is the detail that would unsettle him most. The pulled engine is not being repaired. It is going on a truck to a rear facility. The engine now running in that Sherman arrived this morning in a crate from Ohio. New. Off the line. Nobody touched it on site. It simply fit. That gap, between what the Sherman's designers intended and what the German engineering tradition assumed, is a large part of why Germany lost its armor war in the West. Not the Sherman's gun. Not its armor. The 4 hours. Before we go on, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this story travels. And if you're loving it so far, join the family by hitting subscribe, because tomorrow we've got something special lined up just for you. To understand why 4 hours mattered more than any battle, you have to understand what armor actually consumed across a sustained campaign. A tank does not die the way the movies suggest. The movies show a blinding flash and a crewman's hand falling away from the hatch. That happened, too often, and the men inside did not survive it. But for every Sherman destroyed that way, hulled at close range, ammunition cooking off, crew dead before the fires started, there were many more that died a slower death. A thrown track, a transmission that gave out on a muddy road, a seized engine, an overheated cooling system on a summer afternoon in Normandy, a fuel pump that gave up between the maintenance depot and the line of departure. Belton Cooper, the ordnance officer of the 3rd Armored Division, who spent 11 months driving through contested countryside at night to hand-carry tank loss reports to his maintenance battalion, estimated that for every Sherman his division destroyed beyond recovery, his unit was returning 3 to 4 others to service. 3 to 4 tanks back in the fight for every one that was gone for good. That ratio was not luck. It was the product of a design philosophy baked into the Sherman from the start, and the mechanical center of that philosophy was the decision about what to do when an engine died. The answer the Americans chose was not to fix it on site. The answer was to replace it fast, in the field, by ordinary men, using a documented procedure that could be taught in 6 weeks. The answer the Germans chose was different. Understanding why it was different requires going back inside the German engineering tradition to see what a tank engine meant to the men who built one. The Maybach HL 230P30 is a magnificent piece of engineering, a liquid-cooled 23-liter V12 producing 700 horsepower, forged steel crankshaft, aluminum cylinder heads, a dry sump lubrication system designed to keep oil flowing even when the tank was on a severe slope. German engineers in the 1940s designed engines the way Steinway designed grand pianos. Every component relationship mattered. Every tolerance was specified tight. The men at Maybach Motorenbau in Friedrichshafen understood the HL 230 as an organism, and they treated each example with the care that implied. The problem was not that the engine was bad. The problem was that the engine, beautiful, complex, precision-made, assumed on the other end of the supply chain a man who thought the way its designers thought. A trained specialist. A Facharbeiter, someone who had come through the German apprenticeship system, who understood not just the procedure for replacement but the reason for each step, who could feel when something was wrong before it became catastrophic, and diagnose it from sound and vibration and the color of exhaust smoke. Replacing the HL-230 in a Panther under field conditions involved disconnecting a cooling system with 3 separate radiators and an oil cooler, each with its own fittings and its own opportunities for a stripped thread or a cracked fitting to extend the job by hours. The exhaust pipes had to come off first. The engine mounts, bolted to the hull floor, required access from inside the fighting compartment after partially clearing the turret basket. In a factory, this was a procedure with sequence cards, properly sized tooling, and an overhead crane with a hook machined to fit the HL-230's specific lifting points. In a field in France in August 1944, it was something else. German field maintenance manuals for the Panther estimated engine replacement at 12 hours or more under ideal conditions with a full complement of trained mechanics and the correct tool kit. Several unit reports from the second half of 1944 use a phrase that appears often enough to suggest it was standard: Werkstattarbeit, workshop work, not a field repair. Not something you did under trees with artillery falling 3 kilometers away, something you took back to a building with a crane and light and time. That assumption worked in Poland in 1939 and in France in 1940, when German armored divisions made sharp, rapid advances and then consolidated while mechanics caught up. It stopped working in Normandy, where the front changed daily. The workshops were under Allied air attack. The spare HL-230s were being rationed, and the most experienced mechanics had been in the field since 1941. A lot of them were dead. The Tiger situation was worse. The Tiger I used the HL-230P45 in a hull so tightly packaged around the engine bay that replacement required partially disturbing the turret ring assembly in some configurations. Heinz Guderian, the man who had built the concept of German armored warfare from the ground up, wrote in March 1944 that the repair situation for Tigers had become, in his own word, desperate. Not because the mechanics were incompetent. Because the machine had been built to require expertise that was becoming impossible to field in sufficient numbers. By late 1944, Germany was running replacement crews who were younger and less trained than the men they replaced. The Facharbeiter who knew the Panther HL-230 by touch and by sound were increasingly scarce. The men who replaced them knew enough to operate the tank and not always enough to keep it alive between engagements. The Continental R975 is not a beautiful engine by German standards. It is a 9-cylinder air-cooled radial derived from a Wright aircraft engine design, producing 400 horsepower, less than the Maybach by a wide margin. American tank officers in 1941 complained that it was a stopgap. They were right. The men who put it in the Sherman knew it was a stopgap, and they did something with that knowledge that the Germans never quite grasped. They designed the Sherman around the fact that the engine would be replaced. The rear deck of the M4 was configured so that the engine, the radiators, and the cooling fan assembly could all be removed from the top with a standard military crane or a field-expedient A-frame hoist bolted to a recovery vehicle. The engine itself had designated lifting points, standardized across every R975 that left any of the several factories producing them. The mounts were 8 bolts in a repeating pattern that a trained mechanic could locate in poor light. The fuel connections were standardized. The electrical connections used a plug-and-socket system rather than individual wire attachments to individual terminals. This was not engineering genius. Chrysler and Fisher Body and Ford had been building cars this way for 20 years. The decision was not clever. It was deliberate. The engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground and the Ordnance Department who wrote the Sherman specifications treated maintainability as a design requirement, sitting alongside firepower and protection in the list of things the tank had to do. A component not accessible to an ordinary man in reasonable time was a flawed component. The file was the signal that something had gone wrong upstream. The Sherman's designers had absorbed both of those ideas so completely that they were no longer principles. They were habit. The Ford GAA V8 that powered the later M4A3 was designed specifically for tank use. Ford adapted it from existing car engine work, with accessibility written into the brief from the start. The engine bay in the M4A3 had clearance around the major assemblies that allowed a mechanic to reach the fuel system without first disturbing the cooling system. The replacement manual specified the procedure in numbered steps. Each step assumed that the man performing it had received his training in a 6-week Army course, not a 5-year apprenticeship. That 6-week course is worth stopping on, because it is where the German NCO at the fence would have lost the thread entirely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. In the summer of 1941, as the United States Army stood up new armored divisions faster than any institutional logic could absorb, the Ordnance Department ran into a problem that looked like a crisis and turned out to be the opposite. There were not enough trained mechanics. Germany had the Handwerkskammer, formal apprenticeships, certifications earned over years. A German Army mechanic in 1941 was likely to have been a certified Kraftfahrzeugmechaniker before the war, with papers and a shop to go back to when it ended. There was an established pipeline, and the German military could draw from it. The American pipeline was different. America had no formal apprenticeship system in that sense. What it had was 20 million men who had spent the Depression fixing equipment because they had no alternative. Farm boys from Kansas who rebuilt combine harvesters in the dark because harvest could not wait for morning. Coal miners from West Virginia who kept diesel generators running with parts machined from scrap iron because the company was not going to pay for replacements. Men from Detroit who had been turning wrenches on production lines since they were 15 because the factory needed bodies and the Depression needed income. None of these men had papers. None had certifications. They had hands and the particular kind of mechanical intuition that comes from having fixed things that broke and broken things that almost worked and learned the difference through the specific education of cold metal and deadline and failure. The Army took these men and put them through the Ordnance Replacement Training Centers at Aberdeen, Maryland, and Fort Knox, Kentucky. The courses ran 6 to 12 weeks. They were not producing craftsmen. They were producing men who could execute a procedure correctly, consistently, under pressure, in the dark, in the mud, with artillery dropping 2 kilometers to the east. The manuals they trained from had been written with that in mind, not understand the engine, execute the steps, in this order, to these specifications, within this time, go. By 1944, the United States Army had trained more armored vehicle mechanics than Germany had trained in the preceding decade. Not better mechanics in any craft sense the Germans would have recognized. More mechanics in the procedural sense, men who could not tell you why the Continental R975's oil pressure should read within a specific range during warm-up, but could tell you exactly what to do if it did. Not because step 11 in the technical manual was unambiguous and they had practiced it until it was reflex. This is the part the German NCO at the fence in Normandy could not have understood from where he stood. He was watching men who knew the procedure, not the machine. They were fast because the machine had been designed for men who knew the procedure. They had not spent years acquiring the right to touch an engine. They had spent weeks learning this one sequence, and the sequence was simpler than it looked because the people who designed the Sherman had gone to considerable lengths to make it so. There was a word for what the German engineering tradition had built: craft. And craft, for all its virtues, requires a craftsman. By the autumn of 1944, Germany was running short of craftsmen and had no system for replacing them. America had no craftsmen to run short of. It had procedures, and procedures could be handed to the next man off the train. Now apply that to numbers, because the German bewilderment at individual American maintenance speed was nothing compared to what the aggregate produced. The 3rd Armored Division, Belton Cooper's division, entered the European campaign in Normandy with an authorized strength of 232 Sherman medium tanks. Over the course of the campaign from June 1944 to May 1945, it suffered the complete destruction of 648 Shermans. This is the figure military writers cite as evidence that the Sherman was a coffin on tracks. Read differently, it is evidence of something else entirely. The division was not replaced with 648 vehicles from the rear, though some new vehicles did arrive. It remained a functioning combat division for 11 months of near-continuous fighting, because it was simultaneously recovering and returning to service vehicles that had been knocked out, broken down, or mechanically finished. A substantial number of those vehicles were recovered and repaired more than once, some of them 3 times. The math underneath that is engine math. When a Sherman threw a connecting rod in a Belgian field in December 1944, the tank was not gone. A recovery vehicle came forward. The tank went back to the vehicle collecting point. Mechanics pulled the dead engine in 4 hours. A new engine went in, 4 hours back to the unit. The same hull that broke down on Tuesday was back in the line by Thursday, sometimes by Wednesday night, with the same hull casting and a new heart. German armored units fighting the same division in the same period did not have this. When a Panther's engine failed, the tank went to the workshop. If there was a workshop within reach, if the road was passable, if the spare HL 230 had not been delayed because the factory allocation for that month had been redirected to new hull production on Speer's orders, if the road had not been cut by an airstrike while the tank was in transit. When those conditions did not hold, the tank sat. Men stripped it for parts to keep other tanks running. When it had given everything it could give, they packed the turret with thermite or drove a demolition charge into the hull, and the loss was recorded in the unit diary as destroyed in action, though no Allied gun had touched it. By November 1944, several panzer divisions in France and Belgium were carrying more broken tanks than operational ones. Operational readiness figures for German armored units in that period ran between 30 and 50% in many cases, sometimes lower. The comparable American figure ran between 70 and 90. That 30 to 40 point gap is not firepower. It is not armor. It is not even numbers. It is 4 hours, multiplied across every broken engine in every broken Sherman, in every armored division, for every week of an 11-month campaign. Albert Speer, the Reich's armaments minister, was asked after the war what had gone wrong with German tank production. He gave a long answer, some of which was self-serving, but the technical core of it held up. German industry had prioritized new hulls over spare parts because new hulls were what Hitler celebrated and spare parts were what maintenance sergeants requested. By late 1944, German factories were producing a steady delivery of new Panthers and a desperate trickle of the gearboxes, final drives, and engines those Panthers needed to stay in the field. Speer knew this was a mistake by the time he admitted it. The question was not whether he was right. The question was whether it was too late. It was. On the night of the 17th of December, 1944, the mechanics of the 740th Tank Battalion were working in a salvage depot near Stoumont, Belgium. The German Ardennes offensive had been underway for 36 hours. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, commanding the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, was pushing toward the Meuse with Panthers, Tigers, Panzer Grenadiers, and one functioning road junction at Stoumont between him and open country. American infantry was falling back. American command was trying to figure out who could slow him down. They found the 740th Tank Battalion sitting in Spremont with no tanks. The 740th had been trained on experimental canal defense light vehicles that the Army had decided not to field. They had been retransitioned to conventional Shermans and sent to Europe, but their Shermans had not arrived. They had men. They had officers. They had Lieutenant Colonel George K. Rubel, a wiry 40-something professional from Phoenix who had fought in North Africa and was widely considered one of the better tank commanders in theater. They did not have anything to fight with. Rubel took his mechanics to the nearest salvage depot. What they found there was the Army's word for wreckage in a polite mood, vehicles awaiting repair. Shermans that had been stripped of engines to keep other Shermans running. An M36 tank destroyer with a missing breech block. Half a dozen other hulls in varying states of depletion, none of them officially ready, some of them barely identifiable as the vehicles they had once been. Private First Class Harry Miller, of Columbus, Ohio, was 16 years old. He had enlisted by lying about his age. By the night of December 17th, he had been overseas for less than 3 months. He would later tell an Army interviewer that his hands were so cold and so coated in grease that he could not feel them. He worked anyway. They all worked anyway. They looted working radios from hulls, too damaged to move, and bolted them into hulls that could be started. They found a breech block for the M36 somewhere in the depot's parts bins. They scrounged track links, machine guns, ammunition. Not always matched to the gun calibers they were feeding, which would matter later. They cannibalized the cannibalized. They built 4 fighting vehicles out of the parts of dead vehicles, and they did it in a night. By dawn on December 18th, Rubel had 3 Shermans and 1 tank destroyer running. The mechanics who had built them stayed at the depot to work on a 5th and a 6th vehicle. The 4 that were ready rolled towards Stowmont. What happened next on that narrow road between cliffs and a railway embankment? A Sherman gunner named Corporal Jack Ashby firing 1 round into the gun mantlet of a Panther at 100 yards. The round deflecting down through the thinner steel above the driver. The Panther beginning to burn. The column continuing forward. 2 more Panthers killed in the next 30 minutes. Kampfgruppe Piper's spearhead, blocked on a road it had believed was open, has been documented. 3 Panthers and an armored car knocked out by 4 vehicles assembled overnight by exhausted men with mismatched parts. Piper's column backed up. American reinforcements arrived. Within 72 hours, his fuel supply was cut. Within a week, Kampfgruppe Piper ceased to exist as a fighting formation. Piper himself escaped on foot. Think carefully about the shape of that. A German panzer commander on the morning of December 19th was looking at a road he believed empty. He had Panthers, experienced crews, momentum. He was stopped inside 30 minutes of contact by American Shermans that did not exist as fighting vehicles 24 hours earlier. The German tanks were better. The German crews had more combat experience. None of it was sufficient because the American maintenance philosophy had done something German maintenance could not have done in any 24-hour window in any location in the war. It had taken wreckage and converted it back into combat power inside the time available for a tactical situation to develop. Harry Miller survived the war. He served another 22 years in the Army and Air Force. He retired quietly. He never claimed to have done anything remarkable. He told an interviewer in 2016 that on the morning of December 18th, he was just a cold 16-year-old with greasy hands trying to make a tank run. His name does not appear in the histories of the Battle of the Bulge. It barely appears anywhere. Come back to the German NCO at the fence in Normandy. He has spent his entire professional life inside a tradition that taught him this. A machine as complex as a tank engine deserves the hands of a man who has spent years learning to read it. You do not rush an engine replacement. You do not let a man who has been a mechanic for 6 weeks touch a precision V12 with a chain hoist and a socket wrench. You send it to the workshop. You wait for the Facharbeiter. What he is watching violates every premise that tradition rests on. 4 men, 6 weeks of training, maybe. A procedure out of a manual, a chain hoist, 4 hours, and now the tank is running. The Sherman was not a better tank than the Panther by any measure German engineers would have applied. It was not more powerful, not more precisely made, not more beautifully built. German engineers captured after the war said this openly, and they were right. The Sherman was a cruder object, cheaper steel, simpler geometry, an engine borrowed from aircraft industry and fitted into a hull, sized around the assumption that ordinary men would be working on it in the dark. The American engineers who specified the Sherman and the ordnance officers who wrote its requirements and the training sergeants at Aberdeen who turned car mechanics from Iowa into tank mechanics in 6 weeks had made a wager. In a long war, the tank that can be put back into the fight in 4 hours will outlast the tank that takes 2 days. Not in any single battle. Across a campaign, not when the numbers are equal. When one side is generating knocked-out vehicles faster than the other side can convert them back into combat power. Germany never ran out of brave tank crews or gifted engineers. What it ran out of was Maybach engines and trained men to install them and functional workshops to install them in. The Americans had never had the trained men to run short of. They had mechanics from Iowa, teenagers from Ohio, a chain hoist, a numbered procedure, and a tank design so that those ingredients were enough. The German NCO watched them finish the job. He watched the Sherman start, idle, settle into its running note. He watched the mechanics collect their tools. He watched the tank drive away toward the front, carrying a new engine in its old hull. He had no words for it. His tradition had not provided any, because his tradition had never imagined the question it was being asked to answer. The men who beat him did not need words for it. They needed socket wrenches, a chain hoist, a 6-week course, and 4 hours. In a war that lasted 4 years and cost tens of millions of lives, those 4 hours, repeated across every Sherman, in every armored division, across 11 months of combat, turned out to be the difference between an army that wore out and an army that did not. If this account gave you something you had not been told, hit the like button. It keeps the mechanics in the story visible a little longer. Not the generals, not the tank commanders. The men with the wrenches, who never made it into the famous photographs, but without whom the famous photographs would not have happened. Subscribe for the next chapter. The story of how American industrial culture remade the nature of mechanized war, what it required, who fought it, and with what kinds of hands, is much larger than one engine swap in one field. We are going to follow it. The next time you see a Sherman in a museum, read the placard about its specifications and its famous vulnerabilities, and remember, the machine in front of you is just the hull. The thing that mattered, the thing that kept it in the fight and kept Bastogne in Allied hands, and kept armored divisions moving east when German engineering wisdom said they should have ground to a halt, went home. After the war and fixed cars in Ohio until he retired, and the newspaper in his town never ran a story about it. 4 hours. That was the margin. That was enough. That's the story. For now. If you found it worth your time, subscribing and hitting the bell costs you nothing and helps more than you'd think. Another one's coming tomorrow. Thanks for watching.